Welcome to The One You Feed.
Sometimes the hardest prisons to escape are the ones that we can't see. Shame, grief, anger. These can keep us more trapped than any cell. Shaka Senghor knows this firsthand. He spent 19 years in prison and 7 of those in solitary confinement. But he'll tell you that he was imprisoned long before handcuffs and that his freedom came long before his release. His new book, How to Be Free, A Proven Guide to Escaping Life's Hidden Prisons, is about finding the doors we often don't notice and walking through them. Today, we talk about that journey. I'm Eric Zimmer, and this is The One You Feed. Hi, Shaka. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Eric. I'm super excited to be here and I've been looking forward to this conversation.
We're going to be discussing your book, which is called How to Be Free, A Proven Guide to Escaping Life's Hidden Prisons. But before we do that, we'll start like we always do with the parable. And in the parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with their grandchild, and they say, in life, there are 2 wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops, they think about it for a second, they look up at their grandparent, and they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
That's a great question, and it's one that I was really excited to answer. I came across this parable maybe 15 to 20 years ago, and it really embodies how I think about life and how I think about my own experience, where there was a time that I bought into a narrative that represents that negative wolf, the narrative that my life can only have certain outcomes, and I fed that narrative based on the environment I grew up in. And when I shifted the narrative to the more positive outlooks on life, my life completely transformed. And so that parable embodies how I show up in the world and now, specifically as I show up as a writer, but also as a dad, a father, a husband. And I'm always thinking about what narratives am I consistently feeding, and how does that allow me to really show up in life?
So when you heard that parable 15 or 20 years ago would have been either late in your prison term or after you were out. Did you hear it while you were still in prison?
I think I first came across it right as I was getting close to getting out of prison, which was 15 years ago. And, as you know, when you're an avid reader, you read so many things, and sometimes you lose track of where and when. But it's become such a prominent part of how I parent. I've changed the wolves to pit bulls before. I've changed it to all type of things. With my son, I remember just a few years ago, he was having a tough time in school, and it was the parable that I pulled out for him. And he always comes back to that, of like, okay, which wolf am I feeding today? And it's just such a beautiful, great way to parent and, as well as teach. So it's been quite a while since I've been using it.
Yeah. So let's start with the backstory. I just alluded to the fact that you were in prison, but give us the sort of story that got you to the place where you could write a book about life's hidden prisons.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I grew up in the city of Detroit, hence my ever-present Detroit Tigers hat represents all things Detroit to me beyond just the team itself. And, I grew up in a tough household, a household of abuse, and I ran away when I was a kid around 13, 14 years old. I got seduced into the crack cocaine trade, which is where, when I go back to that narrative, that parable we talked about earlier, that was some of the early beginnings of this negative self-talk. My life outcomes could only end in 2 ways, but I got seduced into that culture. And the reason I say seduced is because what happens often is when young children run away from home, there's adults waiting to prey on them and take advantage of them and kind of bring them into an adult world. And that's what happened to me. I found myself into this culture, and I dealt with all the horrors that came with that culture. I was beat nearly to death. I was robbed at gunpoint. My childhood friend was murdered. And about 3 years in, I was shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. And 14 months later, I got into a conflict at nearly 2 a.m. Over a drug transaction that I refused to make. That argument escalated, and sadly and unfortunately and regrettably, I pulled out a firearm and fired 4 shots, which tragically caused the man's death. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. And I ended up serving a total of 19 years, with 7 of those years being in solitary confinement. And it was in that environment that I began my journey of healing and transforming my life, but also my journey as a writer.
So I want to explore what happened, some of the things that happened in prison. But you mentioned being an avid reader. I'm curious, did you go into prison as an avid reader, or is that something that developed while you were in there?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. It's one of the things I always, tell people is sometimes we hear the story of how people are lucky to be born into a certain area code, or they're lucky to be born into a certain family, a certain amount of wealth. For me, my luck of the lottery was that I was actually literate when I went into prison. The average reading grade level in prison is 3rd grade. And when I first went in, I wouldn't consider myself an avid reader. I knew how to read, but I wasn't really reading anything when I first went in. But I was fortunate. I met these incredible mentors who saw something redeemable in me. These were men who were serving life sentences. They didn't have any, ROI for me other than being an asset to the community if and when I got out of prison. But they saw something redeemable in me, and they guided me to books. And initially, it was just fiction. They was giving me like all of these fiction books that were kind of about the inner city. They was written by authors like Iceberg Slim and Donald Goins and Chester Himes. And once those books ran out, that's when they started giving me more serious books to read. Malcolm X's autobiography, which led to me reading a lot of philosophy and studying theology. And I just became really, really curious about the world. And I would intermingle those books with, fiction. I'm still a big lover of fiction. So I would, check out 2 serious books and 3 fiction books. Books were really my saving grace. It's something I'm a big advocate about literacy, especially in prisons and inner cities, because I know the power of the written word to transform and change lives. And not only do I live it, but I'm also been able to contribute to it.
What are some recent fiction books you've loved?
So I'm actually reading a book. I don't have it with me, but it's something about By the River, and it's written by Wally Lamb. So his most recent book, Place by the River.
I just started that book on Audible like 3 days ago. Holy mackerel, really is that a hell of a start to a book? I don't want to give it away, but oh man.
Yeah. So I'm reading that, and it's so fascinating because it's hard for me to read when I'm writing. So as soon as I got done with my most recent book, I was like, I'm going to read some fiction. I haven't read fiction in a while.
Yeah.
And so I picked Wally Lamb's book up and I started reading that. And so I'm about two-thirds of the way through.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still in the very early part where you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
All right. Interestingly, my story is at 24, I was a homeless heroin addict, and I had the potential to go to jail for a while. I had a whole bunch of grand felonies stacked up on me. Now, you talk about the fortune of the zip code you were born into. I was given a diversion program as an option, which I think happens partially because I was upper class or middle class and white. But when I got sober, one of the things that you just mentioned that I realized was like one of my biggest assets that was really fortunate was the same thing, that I had been taught to read and I liked to read. And that did so much for, my whole life, really. It is interesting, even in like really difficult stories, you can often find there's something in there that leveraged is a point that can be used for better.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things I love about fiction. When I started writing, the first books I wrote were fiction books. And it was because I was able to create these characters with these other worlds and, to really get to the truth faster through fiction, which is so interesting when you think about, when we're actually telling a real life truth. But part of what I've discovered is that, we formulate opinions about other people so fast that oftentimes we don't get to the truth. Whereas with characters, we don't often enter with that same level of judgment. But, I love it. I love the craft of writing. I love the storytelling and what it's done for my life, to spark my imagination and to think beyond those cells that physically held me in place.
So in prison, you mentioned you spent 7 years in solitary confinement, which is usually not awarded to prisoners who are living their best life. You would know more about it than me. I'm making an assumption, but
Yeah.
I'm curious, when did things start to shift for you? Because that's a hard environment for things to shift in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think back to my journey, I'm super transparent and very honest. I didn't start my prison sentence off with putting my best foot forward. I was angry, I was bitter, I got into tons of trouble, and in fact, I made a declaration that I was never going to follow the rules, and I literally honored that. I got 36 misconducts probably within my first 5 years, and so I was getting in trouble all the time. And what it really was that I was hurt. I was sad. I was angry. I was disappointed with my life outcomes. I didn't want to be responsible. There was no accountability on my behalf. And so I was just self-destructing. And it was really the written word that helped me start to really work my way to a sense of one, I had to be responsible and accountable for the decisions I made in life. And I had to be honest with myself. And that was a long, arduous journey. And I know we live in a society where we kind of want things to happen very, very quickly. We want people to have their kind of come to Jesus moment or hit rock bottom. I hit rock bottom a lot,
Yeah.
and then I would hit rock bottom and realize that, there's even something up under that rock, and I would figure out a way to find myself down there. And I was constantly picking myself up, until I got to a space where I was like, I was tired of being tired, and I think that that's when real transformation takes place, is when you get tired of living a very toxic, unhealthy, really sad existence. And, despite being in prison, I realized that I had been incarcerated before I ever had handcuffs on me.
Yeah.
Emotionally, mentally, psychologically, I was already incarcerated, but I got free before I ever left that prison cell. And that's when I realized that the power of transformation and real freedom is an inside job.
Yeah, as somebody who's traveled in addiction circles for the better part of my adult life, right? I've heard that again and again. I used to take meetings 12-step meetings into prisons, and you would see people in those meetings who had started to work a program of recovery, and they would say that. They would say, I am more free now, right? Because addiction is you talk about a prison. We all have prisons. That's like that's like the solitary kind of, right? Like, you're really locked in when you're in there. And that idea that we imprison ourselves. And there's a line in the AA Big Book that says, essentially, we were looking for freedom from self-bondage. And that phrase has resonated with me as much as any over the years, because I've realized exactly that. The degree that I feel free and that I'm free to consciously choose and make choices is the degree to which I am free of that burden of myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's really when you think about the subtitle of how to be free. It's a proven guide to escaping life's hidden prisons. Because what I believe is that everybody has a hidden prison, but every prison has a door. And it's that inside work has been so transformative in my life and the life of those I've been fortunate to mentor and coach. And it shows up in all kinds of ways. You think about addiction, oftentimes that is the symptom. It's not the cause. You get out to the deeper cause.
Yep.
It's childhood trauma. It's a disappointing childhood. It's physical abuse, sexual abuse, like you name it. And all those things lead us down to that path of self-imprisonment. And, what I offer are real tools, much like the Big Book, that gives people agency over their lives and gives them an opportunity to really escape those kind of hidden prisons in their lives.
I love that phrase. Everyone has hidden prisons, but every prison has a door. I mean, that's just a
Absolutely.
beautiful statement of both compassion and hope rolled into one, what is it, 8-word phrase or so? It's really good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So your book really takes us on a 3-part journey. It takes us through the first part, which is sort of identifying and breaking the chains.
Yeah.
Then we talk about finding strength, and then we talk about embracing freedom. So let's kind of start with the chains. And you say they're grief, anger, and shame, and maybe we'll work our way through them. But I want to talk about grief, because the chapter on grief is really powerful. You talk about sort of 3 big losses in there, right? Your stepbrother, your dog, and then sort of your son's health. Can you walk us through that time period?
Yeah, in July 1991, my younger brother was murdered. And it was devastating to our family. You know, he was doing good. He had started to really turn his life around. He had just got his master's degree and was really, sorting out life when he was murdered by a friend of his. And it was devastating. You know, I came home as as a good son to help support my parents. And there was a moment where I saw my mother crying. And I was stricken by this deep sense of guilt because I knew that I had made somebody else's family feel like that during my younger years. And so it made it nearly impossible for me to grieve. And then shortly after that, a few months later, our puppy was ran over by a car after a trainer left the gate open and didn't want to accept accountability. And it was devastating to, tell my son that our puppy had been killed. And then literally just last year, my son was rushed to the hospital, to the ER, and we discovered that he had type 1 diabetes, which completely changed our lives, changed his life. And, grieving his innocence was one of the things that really, as a dad, one, it just made me more empathetic toward people who have children with special needs. And it made me sad. I was so sad to see my son struggle with this new orientation around life. But what I've arrived at with all 3 of those things was the power of gratitude to help you get through grief. And, when I think about my brother's murder, I think about what he meant to me as a brother, more so than how his life ended. What was his life before that? What he meant to our family, the laughs, the jokes, the stories we were able to tell and to experience together. And the same thing with our puppy, Indy. My brother's name is Sherrod. Our puppy name was Indy. And, there are stories that my son and I and my wife, we talk about these moments when we had this big old beautiful football puppy and he would get the zoomies and knock things over in the house, and, how it would send my son into his own hysterics. And so still to have those memories, are really powerful. And then with my son, the spirit of gratitude is knowing that we've raised him to be resilient and we've raised him to be a leader. And he's taken such great control over his own health, from what he eats to how he administers, his insulin. And it is profoundly beautiful to watch this kid who was given something that he didn't ask for. His body turned on him, and for him to rise to the occasion and still show up and compete in sports and show up as a leader in school, help prepare his own meals. Like, I have so much gratitude and so much respect for him, which is just an incredible experience as a parent to have. And so that's what I've learned, the lessons that I share in this book is that, the way I processed the grief of my brother was I wrote a letter to the person who murdered him. And I wrote this letter from a position of really understanding that his life had to be tragic and trauma filled for him to kill someone who he thought of as a friend. And that processing of that horrendous moment, allowed me to have gratitude for all of our journeys and experiences.
The next chapter is about anger, and I want to use anger to look back on grief, because I think what I've heard you saying is that anger is often a way that we stop grief from occurring.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when I was really going through this grieving process, it was so many different emotions that I realized sat beneath what we consider grief,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's the anger of it all, the injustice. And what was really interesting and powerful in my own experience is that up until the point where I dealt with these two tragedies back to back, I had avoided anything that would cause me to get angry because I was afraid of my own anger, given my background and my experience of being in a very anger-filled environment. And then when I was, hit with this devastating news back to back, I realized that the anger that I had in that moment was attached to this deeper anger that I've carried throughout most of my life, from things that had transpired and that I had never got resolution to. And it was really one of those moments of epiphany when, I never thought of myself as the angry person. I always thought about myself as someone who stood up when I felt an injustice happen, or someone who would defend myself in the midst of conflict, but not as someone who was really angry. And it was when I began to process it and, as an adult, post incarceration, where I realized that I've had this deep-seated anger that went all the way back to my childhood, and that anger kind of undergirded all the things related with grief and when even the structure of the book, I kind of stair stepped it down from like grief to anger to shame.
Yeah.
Because in order to resolve into these things and get resolution, you got to get to the root of them.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is interesting in your book and that you do a good job of is holding sort of two truths at one time. And one of them is the absolute importance of facing these emotions, allowing ourselves to feel these emotions, not shoving them down, not avoiding them, not running away, but also not letting them run the show.
Absolutely.
And so how for you, I know this is a broad question, but like let's say we got off this call and you got some piece of news that, I don't know, your book is going to sell 5 copies. That's it. We know that's not true, but you feel really extremely disappointed, right? Like how do you work with yourself when you're having a strong emotion like that? And yet you also know that the answer is I've got 4 more interviews I need to go do. I can't drag this disappointment with me. How do you work with that inside yourself today?
Yeah, that's a great question. This one that really, is also a contributing factor with the book is that there is the duality of holding disappointment, but also recognizing purpose. And what I always come back to is like, whenever there's adversity, whenever there's an obstacle, there's also opportunity. And there's also like, what is this moment meant to teach me, right? And the reverse of that can be true, right? So say I sell 5 million books this week. There's an excitement there, but then there's still a responsibility that I got to do podcasts and interviews and, which can be a hard thing to do when you've achieved extreme success in a short amount of time, right?
Totally.
And so there's always this moment of that's clarifying for me of like, when I'm faced with something that's really, really tough or really disappointing, I always start off with being curious about what is this meant to teach me? What am I meant to extract from this moment? I mean, just recently, I received some news that was devastating. I put in for a pardon. I've been out of prison for 15 years. I've accomplished more in 15 years than most people can humanly even think possible for someone who's never been to prison, let alone someone who's actually been to prison. And I put in for a pardon, and I got the news that not only was the pardon denied, but that I have to apply back in 2 years if I hope to get one. And there wasn't even no reason that they gave for why it was denied. And so, in that moment, it was heartbreaking. It was like, man, this is so disappointing. Like I've worked hard. I've done incredible work throughout the world, global work, policy work, community work, mentorship, you name it, I've done it. And not even with the intention to get the pardon, I've just done it because that's how I live my life.
Right.
And, to be hit with that news, like right before the book goes public and I got to come out and I got to show up and be present, I really sat with it, and I accepted that I was angry and I was disappointed. And then I said, okay, well, what is this opportunity meant to teach me? What is it meant to present in my life that allows me to help other people? And so I was like, you know what? I want to share with people how devastating this was. And, what does it mean for people to get a second chance? And who is deserving of that, right? So it created an opportunity for me to do more work to really help people who have earned a second chance and to challenge society on this idea that people should be punished indefinitely. And you can't expect people to achieve, contribute, be assets to societies if we're going to punish them forever. Now, I know that I'm fortunate and I'm lucky. I'm a writer, right? So I've been able to create my own opportunities. That's not most people coming out of prison's reality, right?
No, it's not.
And if we're saying to people that no matter how much you do in the world, we're still going to just hold just a little bit of punishment. You may not be in prison, you may not be in a prison cell, but guess what? You can't use TSA, or you can't travel to this country, or you can't get insurance on your home or health insurance, or you can't take your child to school because you have a felony. So even though you've served your time, we're still going to hold just a little bit of punishment over your head.
Yeah.
And so if there's anything to come out of this story, hopefully what comes out of it outside of me being upset about it is the opportunity for us as a society to decide, hey, do we want people to come back healthy and whole, or do we not? And so...
Yeah, our policy seems to indicate we don't. I mean,
right.
Just up and down, like I said, prison's kind of I didn't go, but I almost went. And I've had a number of friends who've done, 20 years that I've sort of coached and mentored through their whole time there. And yeah, it's just a messed up system. You come out and you just don't have the same opportunities that normal people have. And I'm not saying you should come out and be like, well, automatically admitted to Harvard. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, though, that we're putting people in a position, we're setting it up so it seems to me that people are much more likely to fail.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? And so, I could be angry and I can be trapped in that kind of system and or I could say to myself, you know what? I'm just going to keep on fighting. I'm going to keep on pushing forward, and I'm going to do everything I can to lead by example and hopefully change some lives and change some policies in the process. And so, that's how the hidden prisons show up. One thing I do know is, like, once you make a declaration of good, you're going to be confronted with challenges to see how firmly you stand on what you've made a declaration to. And so I accept these things. That's how I'm able to hold the duality of, success and failure. And that's the tough thing about it all.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I share your disappointment, although I'm not sure on the same level you do. And thank you for giving us a real life example of, working through something. With me, I often think like I have to start by acknowledging I actually feel something. Because I can very easily shift into, sort of like you said, I can shift into like, well, there's a lesson in this, or, something good will come out of this, or I can talk myself out of having any emotion if I'm not careful, right? So I start with like, okay, I actually do feel really angry. I do feel really whatever. Okay, now what, right? Now what do we do with that? We're going to stick with anger for a second, because near the end of the chapter, you have something I'd like you to expound upon. And you say you often need to ferret out anger from its hiding spots, blind spots, and sore spots. Okay, what are hiding spots, blind spots, and sore spots?
Yeah, when I think about, anger and how it shows up, right? So you're driving down the street, someone cuts you off in traffic, and you go berserk. Is it really that someone cut you off in traffic? Or is it this deeper thing that you've been hiding from, that you've been suppressing, and it just creates an opportunity for you to have that outburst, right? Mm-hmm. And the blind spots are the things we just don't see. It's when your child does something and you go on a tangent, or you're irate and you don't even see the damage that you're causing, because you're blinded by, this anger that's been a part of your life. The sore spots are that one thing that can set you off. For some people, it's traffic. For some people, it's noise. For some people, it's, someone who is, not great at communication. And what I realized in my life was that there was all these different things, and some of them were attached to shame. What is that thing that as soon as you hear it, you feel it, you feel that thing where you have to talk yourself off the ledge. That's that hidden piece of anger. And a lot of times we just aren't aware that that's really the thing. We think it's some external factor that's driving it, but in reality, it's an internal thing, right? And I always use the example of the road rage or getting cut off in traffic or things are moving too slow, because no one is immune to being upset by a poor driver, right? But to go to the extremes of irrational reaction to something that's just a human error usually speaks to one of those three things. And sometimes there's a combination of them, right? But most often there's one of those three things.
It's both blind, hidden, and really sore.
Absolutely.
I am always fascinated by the road rage phenomenon. And I don't mean the type where you get out and crack somebody's windshield with a baseball bat. I just mean how many of us get so bent out of shape. I marvel at it, and I don't marvel at it because I don't do it. I'm just saying, like, I don't fully understand, like, what is it about that like makes us so mad? It's just I'm sure people have studied it. I'm sure there's probably a good answer that I don't know, but I'm always fascinated by it. I also think, these hiding spots, blind spots, and sore spots are also, for me, a good indicator is when the reaction is out of proportion to the thing, right? So like if somebody cuts me off in traffic, I might be mad for a minute and then I'm like, okay, whatever, no big deal, right?
Right.
If I'm still mad an hour later, there are these things that happen that the response is way out of proportion to what happened. That's also for me always a good sign of like, okay, there's, to use your terms, there's something hidden here or something that's particularly sore that I'm not seeing.
Yeah, and it's the difference between having a bad moment and having a bad day. None of us are immune to somebody endangering our lives by cutting us off in traffic. It's a natural reaction, right? It's not natural to like chase that person down and like try to run them off the road, or even think that that's like the way that you handle that. And so I always equate those things to like when there's a deeper thing happening in our lives, oftentimes it shows up in ways that is clear indicators. But if you're not aware that this is the recurrent theme, it's easy to blame those external factors, right? I live in LA, so traffic is always bad.
Yeah.
So, if you want to be just unaware and move through life that way, it's the perfect environment to be upset every day. But if you want to get to the truth, you have to realize like, hey, maybe there's something deeper here, and maybe there's a sore spot or a blind spot or something hidden. And I ended up discovering it through this writing journey, which really comes up in the chapter on shame, that, there were things that was beneath the surface that really was driving a lot of the things that I experienced in my life.
So let's talk about shame. Shame is something I think a lot of people are much more familiar with than they used to be, right? Brene Brown has done a lot of work, but it's just been in the culture. It's been talked about. It's this idea, not that I did something wrong, but there's something fundamentally wrong with me. I've also seen shame to be one of sometimes the hardest things for people to get by or to get over. And I'm curious, what has worked for you?
Yeah, I think journaling probably was the greatest unlock for me when it came to shame. And in the book, and I don't want to give the whole book away, but I think this is a really important part of me discovering this shame that I was carrying. There was a neighbor who was a trusted friend that my parents trusted with our care, trusted us to be around, to hang out with, and he attempted to molest me. And in reaction to him attempting to molest me and me getting out of that situation, and I'm so thankful that I had the spiritual wisdom even as a precocious kid to know that something wasn't right, that I was able to get out of that situation, I was really angry. I was angry at the sense of betrayal. I was angry that this person who I looked to as a hero really was a villain. And so in response to that, I burglarized his house and with the attempt to cause him harm. And I was caught, I was arrested, and I was punished by my parents. And my parents were angry and upset and embarrassed. I was embarrassed in front of our neighborhood, our community. People who had trusted me to be the good kid, the honor roll student, they saw me being led out of this man's house in handcuffs, and that was embarrassing. And so I carried this deep sense of shame about that moment well into my adulthood. And it was through the process of journaling when I was trying to really uproot this sense of like, man, I've carried this anger. What is it? And I realized that I was really angry at my parents because they had not created space for me to say to them, hey, this man tried to take advantage of me, and this is why I burglarized his house. This is why I wanted to cause him harm and hurt. And it wasn't until I was 50 years old, I was turning 50, and I was like, you know what? I need to have a conversation with my parents. And, I was so frustrated with, Brené Brown's interpretation of shame. And she talked about how you got to tell the story. And I was like, I'm tired of telling these painful stories in my life. But it was exactly what I needed to do. And I was able to talk to my parents, and they were present. It was hard. It was really hard for my dad. It was hard for my mother. As a parent, you never want to have that feeling that you've entrusted your child into someone's care that caused them harm. But we were able to sit with it as adults, and so that's what, when you're talking about getting beneath the anger and you're talking about grieving things from childhood, it's those moments like that creates that hidden prison. Because for years, I didn't even make the connection between the anger I carried and the shame that I had for feeling like, man, what was it about me that made this man target me? And what was it about me that made my parents not even be curious enough to know why I did this? I was an honor roll student. I was a scholarship student. I was the smart, good kid on the block. I was the kid who cut neighbors' grass and picked pears from their trees and helped, the older ladies carry their bags to the house. And then, they didn't think that there was something else there. And I was angry. I carried that anger with me for a long time. And that's what shame does, and the way that it showed up in my work is when I didn't get a thing right. And the CEO would come and say, hey, you didn't execute on that right. It would bring up those old feelings, and it erased all the wins, all the times I did get it right. It just completely eradicated that. And that's that hidden prison of shame. That's what it does. It erases your wins, in a way that you're constantly, trying to navigate life against this tide of your past.
Was the fact that you were in prison for murder, which is something that, obviously you've had to reckon with.
Absolutely.
Was that the sort of obvious thing that you needed to reckon with, and so you did earlier and more often than some of these other hidden forms of shame? Or what's that been like?
I think with being sentenced for murder, there were different stages of how I had to reconcile that. And the first stage was I had to accept responsibility that I made a horrible decision. And that didn't come easy. You grow up in drug culture. It's a very violent culture. There's constant conflicts. There's constant threats to your life. I had all type of fears and anger attached to when I was shot as a kid. And those things became an excuse for why I made that decision that night. And what I realized is that those things aren't an excuse. I had to be responsible. I had to be accountable. However, those things did explain how I arrived at that point in my life. And that's what, took me some years to reconcile. So it was a more drawn out, process, because I wanted to get to the root of like, why would I make that decision? Why would that be the decision? Why didn't I take the second step after I took the first step to walk away? And it was really unpacking like this deeper stuff and realizing like, it's ego, it's anger, it's paranoia, it's PTSD, it's a volatile cocktail.
Mm-hmm.
And yet within that volatile cocktail, the truth is ultimately I made the decision and I have to be responsible and I have to be accountable. And that, even though I've been given a prison sentence, that does not atone me to my community. The real work happened when I got out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
I knew getting out of that environment that the work that I need to do to repair harms in my community could only be done once I was physically free. And so when I got out, I immediately started mentoring other kids because I never want another human being to ever live with this type of a burden that hangs over your head no matter what, right? Like I've been out of prison for 15 years. And I can tell you, in the 15 years since I've been out, I have done so many things that have nothing to do with my past. I've accomplished and achieved more things than, I can even write about in one book. And those things are as much a part of my life as my past is. But people get trapped in my past. They get trapped in a singular moment, even though there's been thousands of moments since then that are very compelling. I'm on a Grammy-nominated album with Nas, one of the greatest American poets in the world. And he thought enough of my writing of the craft to ask me to join him on an album. That has nothing to do with the time I served in a cell. Like, my talent is my talent. But, people will always go back to that moment. It doesn't matter. I can have this conversation in 20 years from now. And people will say in 1991, what happened? And it's no fault of theirs. It's just the facts of like how we think about life in our culture. And so I would never want a kid to experience that. I would never want another human being in general. But the reality was I was a kid. I was 19. And so what I did when I got out was like, I'm gonna work to make sure that I do my part to tell the kids how painful it is to live with a regrettable moment over and over and over again. And so, that's the tough work, right? That's the and even within this work, I realized like I had my own hidden prisons around the work, It's angering to have to talk about your past all the time. It's sad, And so I had to figure out ways to do it in a way that honored my humanity while still getting to the truth.
So I think what we're sort of talking about here is forgiving yourself. Yeah. And that is one of, in part 2 of the book, under the finding your strength is forgiveness. And you say something in there that I really like that I think speaks to what you just said. Consider how forgiveness might look in your own journey, not as a single event, but as a series of small choices that gradually lighten your load. What would be your first step? And I love that idea because I don't think that we forgive ourselves or others all at once, generally, right? Like my guess is this ground of forgiving yourself for what happened back then, you have been over this ground a lot to get to the degree of freedom that you do have around it. Say more about the process of all of this.
Absolutely. The forgiveness is so powerful in general, right? Like to forgive someone else, to free yourself of the burden from carrying anger, disappointment, sadness, grudges, whatever you carry when you refuse to forgive someone. I mean, it's such a powerful gift to give yourself to lighten your load and to let yourself, live your most free life. It's even more difficult when it comes to self-forgiveness. Because we self-flagellate, we beat up on ourselves over and over and over again. And negative self-talk, it's one of the biggest hidden prisons. You're like, man, I'm unworthy. I don't deserve this. I feel bad about myself. I'm not good. It's all that negative talk that comes with the inability to forgive. And what it looks like over time is that gets lessened. You know, you start, for me, I started to develop different language for it. You know, the language that was a singular event at a very particular time in my life. It wasn't the entirety of who I am. And so over time, it took me finding new language. It took me writing about, you know, the moment. It took me being responsible and accountable and saying, hey, you know, I made a poor decision. I made a horrible decision, a regrettable decision that can never be unchanged. And I did that as a broken kid. And in that moment, that kid was responsible for that singular act, but it's not all of who I am. And so it was writing it down and being able to own that there's other parts of me. There's other ways that I've lived my life. There's other ways that I've shown up. It was recognized that I let myself down. You know, and so that ability to reframe language, not reframe the experience, because the experience is the experience, and it's a real experience that really happened that I'm really responsible for. But it was reframing the language around the finality of judging this kid for the rest of his life from that one singular act. And that's the work, right? That's where the mantras come from. That's where imagining your life without that trauma and then giving yourself that gift. You know, that's where rewriting the narrative of self, you know, and reimagining what does your life look like when you don't cause harm, and then making a choice to not cause harm. So it's all those things that really became part of that kind of long drawn out process. And there was moments where you can get pulled right back into that old feeling. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have tools, it's hard to get out. But fortunately, you know, what the book provides is a toolkit that helps you keep moving forward, even when something tries to pull you backwards.
Yep. I think that idea of that you keep talking about, which is that on one hand, you take responsibility, and on the other hand, you recognize like you didn't enter that moment in a vacuum, right? We are always, I think, to a certain degree, a sum of the causes and conditions in our lives, both good and bad. You know, Absolutely. It's not that there's not choice, but it's not like a completely free choice, as if the way I talk about this sometimes is like the difference of choice I have now about doing drugs or not is radically different. The amount of choice I had at 25 felt incredible. There was some element of it in there. I had to be the one that went into recovery, right? But the choice I had then and the choice I have now are very, very, they feel very different.
Absolutely.
And so I think that I've seen people, and at different points in my my healing journey, get stuck on one side of that. Either it's all responsibility. I just shouldn't have done it. Like all the running ourselves down. Or the opposite, which is like, well, you know, of course I did that. Like I was just this, I was abused. I had all these things happen. Mm-hmm. And there's a middle ground of agency in there somewhere. Absolutely. That I think can be, I feel like I've straddled it a bunch of times, and hopefully maybe in later years, I've gotten a little bit better at doing it. But you talk about that really eloquently here and in the book a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about the world we live in now, where we want to have these very clear binary philosophies, right? Yeah. It's an either or proposition. And it's one of the, things when I think about the Robert Frost poem, and it's like the road, let's travel, right? You can take this path or that path. And the reality is a lot of times you got to carve a new path. There's a new ground to be pursued. And that is when you can kind of merge these worlds, right? Where yes, there's some agency there. Yes, there's some responsibility. And these things really did happen to me, right?
Yep.
I really did get shot. I really got shot, and there was no treatment, and there was no care, and there was nobody to coach and talk through all these things. And then I also made the choice to carry a gun, and I created a narrative that led to me pulling the trigger. Those things, we can hold space for both of those, right? And it's not about letting me off the hook. I've served my time, right? So I don't have a vested interest in not being responsible. I've already served the time.
Yep.
But what my real interest is telling the truth. And if I can tell the truth, the whole truth, it helps us recognize, hey, if we see somebody else on that path and we see them early enough where we can catch it, maybe we can prevent, a catastrophe from happening. And that's what agency really looks like, is ownership over all of the experience, not just part of it.
That's very well said. I want to jump to another part of the book that I think Boyle brings this whole messy nature of, like, things just aren't one thing or the other. They are confusing. And it's a story as an Ohioan. I live in Columbus, Ohio. So I am a you might imagine a Cavs fan. Right? And you tell a story about a Cavs game. It is the game. I know it well, everything about it. Tell this story because it's, I resonated with it just from, like, my God, what a choice kind of thing. But it also gets into this fact that there aren't clear answers about what the right thing is.
Yeah, that's such a great question. That story is one that I will hold over my son's head for the rest of his life.
You're going to be like 90 and you're going to be like, you are coming here to change my diaper because exactly.
Yeah, no, I it was game 7, NBA finals, and I got invited to be courtside at the game. And it was also Father's Day. And I had made a promise to my kid that I would be home for Father's Day to spend it with him. And I made the choice. I think he was maybe 4 or 5. And because I gave him my word, I felt this, this immense sense of responsibility to actually fly back. Because I was already in LA. I was in LA. I was living in Detroit. And all I had to do was take an hour flight up north to Oakland to watch this game 7 and against Golden State. And I opted to honor my word with my son and fly back. And it was one of those moments where I realized that, there's moments in life where we're faced with a decision and we can over-index on how we choose to make the decision. And that's what I did. I felt this immense sense of guilt that if I didn't show up on Father's Day, that I was somehow letting my son down. And it wasn't until years later that I'm like, he wouldn't have knew the difference between Sunday and Monday. I could have went and watched that game 7, the LeBron block. I could have been a part of history.
One of the greatest games of all time. Yeah.
One of the greatest. And I'm a big basketball fan. So I'm like, I probably would have been on the screen, immortalized in every NBA film as the crazy fan that ran on the court like, that was crazy. Yeah. And I forewent that moment for my son, and so it's wisdom, it's life lesson learned, and now it's a funny story I can tell him, and hopefully, because he's just now kind of getting into basketball. And I'm like, I can't wait till you fall in love with it, because I can really hammer home the point of how much I love you.
What a good dad I am. Well, what I was stuck about, what really hit me about that story, besides the fact of, like, you missed this iconic moment, was you talked about the ambivalence that pulled at you, not just then, but has continued to, right? Yeah. There are 2 easy narratives there. The one narrative is, what a great dad you are. You gave up this huge, important thing to go spend Father's Day with your son. That's one narrative. Mm-hmm. The other narrative is you shouldn't give up everything that's important to you for somebody else. You should, and neither of them are right. Right. The fact that you've had ambivalence for so long about this, I think, really hits at this fact. And I think so many of us fall into this thing. I think that at a certain point in life, many of us, it's like we're battling between our values and our desires, right? And that's a certain type of battle. But I think the next version of that is when you're battling between your values and your values. Right? When you're battling between love of your son and yet something that is also hugely personally important to you. Those are the ones that I think make life so challenging. Absolutely. Is that there's no right answer.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it, right? Is that, it's a great thing, but it's also the challenging thing of life, right? Is that there are no right answers, in some of these things. And what the reason that I share them is that we end up beating ourselves up over and over again, even though there is no right answer.
Yeah.
And like, that's the hidden prison part of it. Is sometimes you have to recognize that, there's no clear and easy path, and whatever path you choose, you just have to make peace with it. And I did that with my son. Yes, I missed the game, and yes, I could have been in that moment, but also love the fact that I made the choice because I love being a father.
Yeah.
And whether he remembers it or not, I still found a way to have a great evening watching the game, and still was able to celebrate, being a dad in a special way. And sometimes that's what you get from it,
I feel pretty certain you're going to help him remember.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Shaka,
I can't wait.
Shaka, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed the book, and thank you.
Truly an honor, and really appreciate it, and love everything you're doing. I mean, it's such a great title for a podcast.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.